Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Before we begin, I have the honor of introducing our ICSC spokesperson, Sister Hadab Tarifi, who will begin with opening remarks.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Greetings of peace. I very much appreciate everyone joining. In our continuation to share teaching sessions about Palestine so that our community gets educated about the history of Palestine so that we have a background to be able to compare to what we're hearing in the news. It is always important that we get the history and get the perspective and the narrative from experts who not only know the stuff, but they can definitely teach all of us. We are honored today to have with us Dr. Mahmood Ibrahim. Dr. Mahmood Ibrahim was until recently a professor of history at Cal Poly Pomona, where he taught courses on Islam, the Middle East, and North Africa, and historiography and history methods on the undergraduate and graduate levels. He served as the chair of the history department for 2 terms from 1996 to 2004. He was awarded the Hart Award for Outstanding Faculty Leadership in 2017. Born as a refugee in the West Bank town of Ramallah, few months after the Nakba, when his family and the whole village of Jimzo was driven out by the Zionist militia after July 11, 1948, Dr. Ibrahim immigrated to the United States in 1966 and lived in New York City's Lower East Side. He received his BA from City College of New York in 1973. Dr. Ibrahim then moved to Los Angeles, where he attended UCLA, from which he received his master's in 1974 and PhD degree in 1981. As a scholar of Middle Eastern studies, he was awarded several Fulbright grants and National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship to conduct research in Cairo and Damascus. He participated in several summer seminars funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, Islamic Science at Columbia University, Just War and Jihad at Rutgers University, and St. Francis of Assisi, and during his time in Italy. Dr. Ibrahim taught as a visiting lecturer at UCLA, UC Santa Barbara, and UC Riverside before he went to Birzeit University in Palestine, where he became chair of the Department of History, Geography, and Political Science from 1985 to 1989, most notably during the first Intifada, when the university and teaching were driven underground. We are honored to have Dr. Ibrahim with us tonight, where he will present the history of Palestine. This is the first series. Next week, he will also be joining us for another lecture on the history of Gaza. Back to you, Dr. Ibrahim, and thank you for this opportunity for teaching us.
Thank you, Hidab, and thank you, Erica, for setting up the Zoom meeting. And thanks to everybody who's joining us. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak about Palestine. I've never turned the chance to speak about such an important issue. It's my life. So I want to discuss the history of Palestine through a series of maps and a PowerPoint that would perhaps either guide me towards the points of the lecture and also give you, the audience, a visual clue as to what we are talking about and what we're talking about. So I'm going to share this PowerPoint with you, and I'll start by talking about Jimzo share, this is the village that I would have born in had not my family and the rest of the village were driven out after July 11th, 1948. And I want to point to the exact spot where I would have been born. And this is right there. And you can see, if those for you who know Arabic, would be Dar Ibrahim Isa Al-Jamal. That is, Al-Jamal is the family name of our clan, so to speak. This map was drawn by my father, Ahmed Ibrahim, my late father, who in 1990 went back to Palestine. Actually, he was coming back from the pilgrimage from Mecca and stopped in Palestine and went to the village where it was. Of course, it had been destroyed. It's one of the villages that, the 500 or so villages that had been destroyed in 1948. So Jimzu is in the center of Palestine. That's right there with the blue underlined, almost equidistant to the two major towns of central Palestine, Lidda and Ramla. Alternately, Lidda or Ramla were the capital of the district of central Palestine, even going back all the way to the Umayyad period, where Ramla was built by the Umayyad dynasty, which ruled from 661 to 750 AD. Jimzu, as you can see, was strategically located, and in 1948, after the truce that had been signed, that ended in July, the Haganah and other Grati Brigade really encircled with a pincer movement to take Lidda and Ramla. And of course, in the process, the villagers and the villages that surrounded in an arc like that, if you see like that, were really driven out. My father, I know my uncles and several others who were part of the resistance had retreated back to the village in the face of the invading army. And from then, they basically, the whole village was evacuated, and very quickly, right after, which was planned anyway, the village was demolished. The village does not exist right now. It has been, the site of Jimzu was taken over by what is known in Hebrew as a moshav, and they call it moshav Jimzu. It is a settlement, basically, and the land of Jimzu and the land of Kharuba, Annaba, but mostly Daniel and Jimzu are very close to each other with the red, there, Jimzu and Daniel. This has been turned into what is known as Mexico Park or Park Mexique. Basically, the Israelis, once they demolished a Palestinian town, they would plant quick growing saplings of pine trees to cover up the demolished villages. And so wealthy Mexican Jews donated a bunch of trees, thousands of trees, and basically tried to camouflage the village. But those of us who know know that these types of forests that they created were basically to hide the destroyed villages. And so I was really born in the Nakba of 1948, and you know, it gives me thought as much as to the children that are being born today in Gaza and in the West Bank, or the children who are being killed in Gaza and the West Bank. And this is my life. This is basically makes me very much in the process. And it, since I was born in the Nakba, basically, modern history of Palestine since 1948 is really my life story. So Palestine is an area that is very much in a strategic location. Right there at the corner of the Mediterranean, southeast corner of the Mediterranean, and it is the passageway between Asia and Africa. And so from time immemorial, you have people, humans, humanoids even before, passing through this territory. And indeed, this particular territory is rich with the culture that has been created over the centuries. So the area has been, as I say, inhabited very well and very well populated. In the 9th century, this is where the claim to that the Jews have to Palestine. There were these two kingdoms, Kingdom of Israel and Kingdom of Judah in the south, which lasted for about 75 years, actually. By 925 BCE, there was no longer any political entity that existed after that. And because of the constant imperial shifting, whether it is the Pharaohs or the Hittites or the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Persians or the Byzantines, etc., they're basically that area is so strategic that they were in control. And so as far as populations are concerned, as far as religions are concerned, in the beginnings, of course, you have paganism, and indeed, eventually by the 5th century BCE, when Judaism began to be formulated and take form, more and more people began to adhere to Judaism. Again, it was not really finished form, but it's an evolving form. And Jews had existed in the region from that time. And once in a while, according to the imperial whims, like the Romans or the Byzantines, they would require Jews to evacuate. And sometimes, for example, for nearly like 500 years, Jews were forbidden to go into Jerusalem until the Muslims came after in like 620, 635, 636. So as a territory known as Palestine that we know today, that did not exist anywhere in any of the historical periods. The name of Palestine actually came from one of the tribes of the Philistines. And the Philistines is a group of sea nomads. It's a mystery where they came from, actually, who invaded Egypt and the southern coast of Palestine. And one of the tribes of the Philistines were known as Peles, and where's Palestine comes from. But as a boundary, the present boundary that we know has come way into the future, and I will get into that. Just to show, during the Abbasid period, remember I mentioned the Umayyad period. The Umayyad dynasty ruled after the Khulafa al-Rashidun, the rightly guided period, which the Umayyad ruled from 661 to 750, as I said. The Abbasid dynasty came after them, and they ruled the Near East from 750 all the way to 1258, nearly 500 years. And as you can tell, 500 years is a long time, and indeed from the beginning and to the end, the Abbasid dynasties can be different from the beginning as it is from the end. And so you can see Palestine as a jund right there with the boundaries. It is basically the southern areas of what we know today as Palestine. And Jund, basically an administrative unit that the Abbasids formulated, and it has roots in the Byzantine administrative divisions that existed before. And Byzantium was the imperial power that ruled from like 325 to about when the Muslims conquered Syria from them around 638 with the Battle of Yarmouk. And it was really, by the way, the Byzantines who forbade the Jews from coming into Jerusalem. And so these boundaries shifted. In the 19th century, this is a 19th century map of the Ottoman period. I'm going to skip over because this really, that particular region continued to be the same and continued to be under the domination of one power or another. After the Abbasids, it was the Mamluks, the Ayyubids, and then the Mamluks. And the Mamluks ruled from Egypt and Syria. Syria was one province and Egypt was another. And Syria was divided into sub-provinces. Again, Palestine was one of the sub-provinces of Syria. And so the Mamluks ruled from 1260 all the way to 1516. 1516, it was the Ottoman Empire that came in under the leadership of Salim the Grim and took over Syria, Palestine, parts of the Arabian Peninsula, as well as Egypt. And again, they took over the administrative divisions that had existed. And you can see there's Gaza at the bottom right there. But that's the whole, nearly the whole of Palestine as one of the administrative units. North of it was Acre and then Tripoli. That particular division was changed in the what is known as the Vilayet Reform Law of 1858, and you can see that the Vilayet of Syria or Syrian provinces, Syrian province was basically divided into sub-provinces, and sometimes, I mean, all the way down to the Sanjak, all the way down to even the village from the Sanjak. And 1858, by the way, was this law, as well as the land registration law that had been passed, were very detrimental, I should say, to the people of the region, because, and especially the Land Registration Act, TAPU, they called it, required the individuals to register the land in their name, in the peasant's name. And the peasants basically balked at that particular requirement, because at that time, the Ottoman Empire was trying to centralize and control its provinces and population, because it was facing imperial pressure from France and England, who were vying to take over the territories of the Ottoman Empire. And so they were very much in need of conscripts, that is, army. And the peasants did not want to join the army, and therefore some of them did not want to have any record attached to their name for the Ottoman Empire. And so much of the land was registered in the name of the head of the village or the chief of the tribe. And this particular law was detrimental in Iraq. And until today, the Iraqi population really suffered the consequences of that, because vast territories, land were registered in the name of the sheikh, and the villages basically became landless. And so that will be very much a consequence that Palestinians suffered in the 20th century, when large landowners, mostly absentee landowners, sold some of that land to the Jewish agency, and Palestinians found themselves landless and even sometimes homeless. So as you can see, Palestine really, the present boundaries are a function of a later period, and as such, this idea that you can go back to history and claim all of that territory for yourself because your great, maybe nobody even related to you had lived there is kind of strange from a historical perspective, that is. Palestine in the 19th century became so significant after the 1869, 1870s, and especially at 1879 when the Suez Canal was opened. At that time, of course, the world powers were in Europe. It was England and France, and they were competing with each other for territories to take from not only the Ottoman Empire, but the other places in the world where there were no states, like Africa, for example. So the passage, and we see that, by the way, today with the Houthis in Yemen, how they can influence the economy, world economy, is that trade from Europe to India, which was the breadbasket of England, was the crown jewel of the English Empire, went around the Cape of Good Hope, and here it is, 12,300 miles from Bombay, if you want, all the way to London. Now, with the opening of the Suez Canal, through the Red Sea, it cut down to 7,200 miles in terms of cost, in terms of time. All the shipping had improved. And so that area, especially southern Palestine, became so significant for the competing empires, and most significantly England, because England was vying for influence in the Eastern Mediterranean and trying to edge out France. And France, of course, was trying to edge out England, but the more power was in the hands of the British. So really, they in their hubris, imperial hubris, they think that they're going to own the area forever, and therefore they thought that this is theirs, and therefore they want to keep anybody out of that. For that purpose, when World War I was about to happen, and there's a lot of steps that historians can point to that the World War I was becoming inevitable, England and France secretly negotiated among themselves to divide the area of the Near East among themselves. There's England and France. Now, they were in Egypt, of course. England had taken over Egypt in 1882. And by the way, in exchange for England taking over Egypt, France took over Tunisia. And so France began to implement its imperial design of taking over the whole of North Africa. It had already colonized Algeria by 1830. And so 1882, they took Tunisia, which is very important. Of course, they edged out the Italians who were trying to take over Tunisia, and then began to make their push to take Morocco. And indeed, by 1912, they were eventually colonized the whole of North Africa. So Egypt was already in the hands of the British. And so they wanted to keep the French out and from the other side of the Suez Canal. And the negotiations between Christopher Sykes and Monsieur Picot, these are the foreign secretaries of England and France, respectively, divided the Near East into zones of influence. And you can see here that the red zone is British because they've already been messing up there, because of course the Gulf, Persian Gulf, or the Shatt al-Arab, all the way to India. Again, you know, India is a prized possession. They don't want anybody to mess around with that. And the Orange is the British zone again, and the green here is the French, and the blue is a French influence rather than direct control. It's an influence. The same thing with basically just dividing up the region amongst themselves. And this is the beginnings of how Palestine, as we know it today, begins to emerge. By the way, this line between the orange and the green, and if you can see it, if I'm pointing to maybe with the pointer here, you can see that line still exists between Syria and Jordan. And the line was between Lake Urmia, as you can see, lake in Persia, all the way down to the Gaza Strip, like this, like that. And so the present line is now between Syria and Jordan. So Palestine, therefore, would take this shape. This is the beginnings of the present area. Now, to make things more firmly in the hands of the British, the Foreign Secretary at that time, Lord Balfour, promised the Zionist movement, which had already become a player in the region and a player in European politics, and especially in British politics. Lord Balfour gave this promise. Mind you, this is November 2nd, 1917. England did not yet have firm control. It's only by the treaty, secret treaty. By the way, the secret treaty was published only after November 1917, when the Bolshevik Revolution took place in Russia, and they published all of the secret dealings with the imperial powers. That's how people knew that the French were scheming and the British were scheming amongst themselves. And to make, to strike it while it's hot, Lord Balfour gave this declaration, very timely, right, with the November Bolshevik Revolution, allowing or promising that they will work towards creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine. It's a very contradictory thing because, first of all, they did not consider or consult the local population, whether Palestinian Muslim or Christian or Jews. They did not consult all the Jews. They did not own the place. And so they went ahead with this particular ploy so that they can claim in future that this is theirs, as had been set by imperial powers, European imperial powers in 1885. For the scramble of Africa was basically any power in Europe can go and have a verbal agreement with some tribal chief somewhere, and that will hold as a valid claim to that particular territory. And that's why the coast of Africa is riddled with all of these mini states, because there was a scramble to go and have these kinds of agreements so that they lay claim for the territory. So the Balfour Declaration was given to the Lord Rothschild in the name of the Zionist movement. Now, I want to just give a little bit more, a few minutes here. For Zionism is a secular ideology that emerged towards the end of the 19th century amongst what is known as assimilated Jews, urban assimilated Jews. Theodor Herzl, who is credited as the founder of Zionism, was from Vienna, as a journalist. And in France and England, Jews had taken advantage of the liberalization of the policies and and that allowed Jews to assimilate into society. Now, that was not so in Eastern Europe, in Russia and the Pale of Settlement, and Poland, basically Eastern Europe in general. The Jews were not necessarily rich, were not necessarily secular. And so when they, under the pressure of the Tsarist Russia and the pogroms that they carried out against their own Jewish population, many of them began to migrate towards the western part of Europe, which put the secular Jews into a ticklish situation. And so it is a kind of an impetus to find a place, another place for them to be, rather than create the kind of condition that might, have a backlash against their own status as assimilated urban and Jews. And so Zionism can be seen as a way of the secular Jews like Herzl to get rid of this population and put them somewhere else. And somewhere else was not necessarily Palestine in the first place. Uganda was considered. The eastern part of Libya was considered. Parts of Argentina were considered. And it was not until 1902 that Palestine, with the imperial intent of the British and others, began to solidify, so to speak, the connection and bring back the connection between Judaism and Palestine. And so, latching upon that, using the religious connection, the Zionists said, we want to establish it in Palestine. And so the work of Chaim Weizmann, for example, who was again immigrated from Eastern Europe to Switzerland, eventually to England, was a very successful chemist, helped the British develop material for bombings in World War I, was very influential, very high status, and he was one of the individuals that began to push the British government for a recognition of a promise like this one that we see, the Balfour Declaration. Now, at the time in Palestine, so that it began, now we have a map that we can associate with the name, and that would be west of the Jordan, south of the line that connected Lebanon and Syria, all the way down to the Sinai, which was considered part of Egypt all the time. And so that particular area west of the Jordan, therefore, began to be considered Palestine. And in that region, they wanted to hold or create that particular Jewish homeland. At that time, you have the population of the, you can see figures from 1882 to, let's say, to 1918, when the declaration was given. Muslims and Christians were 276,000, and the Jews were 24,000. By 1914, natural growth, there was some attempt by the Rothschilds to settle some Jews again, get rid of those population and put them somewhere else. This is what is known in history as the first Aliyah. That's when first waves of immigrants came to Palestine and began to set up some sort of settlements. Some of them stayed, some of them went back to Europe, and eventually also back to the United States. So 1914, you got 94,000 Jews and 595, 500,000, let's say. None of those were consulted in the Balfour Declaration. By the way, you can see 1918, the Jewish population decreased. Why? Because of World War I. Actually, what happened in World War I, the British made a blockade on Palestine and not allowing food I mean, very much the same thing today, not allowing food, equipment, etc., because Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. And as such, there was a great deal of starvation, a great deal of death and destruction. My grandmother was a child at the time, and she would tell me, I learned history from her. And that's her life experience. How not only that the British would not allow food to come in, but the Ottoman soldiers who are fighting, they would go into a village and take the food of the villagers themselves. And so, indeed, many thousands of people died in Palestine during World War I, not from fighting, but from hunger, from starvation. So many of the Jews who had the chance to leave Palestine left. And you can see there was a reduction of at least 34,000 individuals. World War I was over, and the victors were the Allied powers, and of course they created the conditions by which they would shape the world order after what their interest had. And these are the San Remo agreements and all of the other agreements that were reached by the rump or the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. And eventually what also created what is known as the League of Nations. And the League of Nations gave the British the mandate to bring Palestine into the League of Nations. That is, they're not mature enough to come to be a state, and therefore, this is again the imperial hubris, this paternalistic type of look that Europeans had regarded the rest of the world. We were going to bring them up to the level that they can join the League of Nations. And so the mandate was given to England over Palestine, contrary to all of the recommendations and all of the insistence of the local population, and even the recommendations of emissaries and commissions appointed by the United States to study the situation. The Zionists scored their biggest success to date. First was the Balfour Declaration. The second was when the British took over the mandate, because in the document of the mandate, in the preamble to the mandate, they included the Balfour Declaration. So they indeed, the mandate began to be the implementation of the Balfour Declaration. That, of course, created a huge issue for the local population. Resistance was immediate, but the local population was now left on its own. And imagine all of a sudden, this particular population have been severed from their natural connection across the river, natural connection to the north, that is in Lebanon, natural connection to the northeast, that is Syria. They were left to their own devices, so to speak. And so the resistance is going to begin slowly. And what we also notice is that Palestinian nationalism begins to also emerge at this particular moment in time, because that's history tells us how nationalism emerges when you have a common identity, a common struggle, a common challenge. And indeed, Palestinian nationalism begins to solidify from this time onward. It will have a great many challenges along the way. In 1948 was the greatest challenge, 1956 again, and then 1967 again. But eventually, Palestinian nationalism, the Palestinian sense of identity and a sense of statehood would emerge and begin to solidify and become a factor in the politics of the region. Few notable dates to give: 1921, the creation of the Jewish Agency. And the Jewish Agency, contrary to what has been and always talked about, insisted on using Jewish labor only. So they would buy the land and employ Jewish labor only. And in public, they say, "Oh, we're going to do cooperation. We have economy, this and that." But the constitution of the Jewish Agency was that it would be Jewish labor only. By 1929, the first disturbances took place actually in Hebron, and that is a result of what is known as the arrival of revisionist Zionism. Revisionist Zionism was started by Vladimir Jabotinsky, an immigrant from Poland, who began to insist that the Balfour Declaration actually meant a state that where the Jordan runs in the middle of it. That is, the eyed on the the eastern part of the Jordan River also. Great many disturbances took place in Hebron, Al-Khalil, and indeed Al-Khalil continues to be the flashpoint until today. The British, very disingenuous to the locals, they began to appoint commissions here and commissions there to study what the problem is. And of course, the problem has always been known. You promise this particular territory to somebody who is coming from outside. You're allowing them to lord it over the population. You are disregarding the aspirations of the local population. You are destroying the economy of the local population. For example, when the grain harvest in Palestine is plentiful, the British will open up the market for Canadian wheat. And so therefore the Canadian wheat will come in and compete with local production. And indeed the peasantry would suffer these deprivations, and eventually they will squeeze so that they can sell their land, abandon the land, and again sell it to the Jewish Agency, which allows only Jews to work that land. Until today, by the way, the land is owned not by individuals, it's leased to individuals and only Jews, and it is owned collectively by the Jewish Agency. So let me go back to the population and talk about it. You can see how, because of the policies, in 1922, 83,000 Jews. By 1931, and this is the Zionist movement is very emboldened, and Ben-Gurion, who was head of the Jewish Agency at the time, says, we want Palestine to be Jewish as England is English. And indeed, the shifting of alliances begins also to take place, alliances to the United States, what is known as the Biltmore Program. But here we are talking about World War II already, right? 1931, 1932, Hitler comes into Germany, the Nazis are slowly emerging as the effective power in the, and that, of course, spikes the immigration of Jews to Palestine. Many of them didn't come to Palestine. They don't want to go to a third world backward country, quote unquote. They wanted to go to other areas, let's say United States or South America. And many times the United States would not allow them to come in. Even in the 1940s, they did not allow the Jews to come in. So by force, therefore, they found themselves going back to Palestine. And you can see by 1936, this is 384,000 Jews. The increase is tremendous. And indeed, that caused what is known as the 1936 Palestinian Revolt. Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam led that particular revolt, and it required the British to send in troops of 100,000 soldiers to quell the Palestinian resistance at the time. So from 1936 to 1939, you know, in Europe, this is the beginnings of the lead up to World War II. And the British were trying to mollify some of the local resistance, not only by force of arms, as I say, 100,000 British troops trying to quell individual resistance and group resistance here and there, but also by trying to say, well, you know, maybe the Balfour Declaration, maybe we cannot do this, maybe we can limit the population. And they sent another commission of inquiry, as if we don't know already what's the problem. And so the commission of inquiry was known as the Peel Commission. And the Peel Commission came in and studied the situation and said, look, we need to, there's so much land is being taken away from the Palestinians and sequestered from their ownership. Many of them have become landless. The urban areas, Haifa, Akka, Jerusalem, were filled with lumpen individuals who have lost their land and they can't, you know, day laborers. And so there's a great deal of tension because of the policies of the British. And so the Peel recommendation was to divide the area between the Arabs and the Jews. So the green was supposed to be for the Jewish state, and the orange was for, this is by 1939, by the way, was supposed to be for the Palestinian population, with an international corridor and Jerusalem being an international city. So all of a sudden, a third of Palestine was given the most fertile areas, by the way, the plains of Palestine were given to the Zionists. And indeed, by that time, as I mentioned, the collusions, the kind of situation really beat down on the Palestinian peasantry, that their leadership were in disarray. Azzuddin al-Qassam was assassinated. Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, was exiled. And so they are really under occupation of a determined military that was going to implement a particular vision, and that is to create a Jewish state. But the circumstances forced them to recommend this particular division. Well, as a historian, I would say actually the defeat of Palestinian nationalism was really this particular moment when by force, again, don't forget, 100,000 British troops were quelling, quote unquote, the disturbances and the revolt. So what 1939 was something called the White Paper, again, another British promise saying, oh, we probably made a mistake. The area cannot absorb so much people, and therefore they began to limit immigration to Palestine. This, of course, had created the excuse for Jewish militias to say that they are going to be opposed to the British and British policies. Although, I mean, by that time, the Zionist movement was, let's say, of several factions. The faction that Ben Gurion, who became eventually the first prime minister, led, accepted the partition. Yeah, this is like a free gift. What the heck? So they accepted the partition, and thinking that with that, they begin to have a foothold to increase whatever territory they had. But World War II took place from 1939 to 1945. And as I mentioned, the White Paper of 1939 that said we're going to limit immigration gave excuses to people like Menachem Begin, who eventually became a prime minister too. He was a leader of the Irgun, and his buddy, Shimon, Shimon, that's a scholar, Shamir, who also became a prime minister in the 90s, the excuse to oppose the British. And, you know, in Israeli history, they think that's their national liberation, That's what they call national liberation. When they began to oppose the British, who wanted to limit immigration for this particular period of time and to allow only immigrants according to the absorption capability of the country. Britain, as we know, was defeated by World War II, and they said, we cannot deal with the situation, we have to give it to the United Nations, which had just come out into being as a result of World War II. Once again, the United Nations recommendation or commission decided once again to partition Palestine. A state for the Arabs, Palestinians, and the other for the Jews. And you can see here the partition plan of 1947, November 29, 1947 is the date when this particular recommendation was passed by the United Nations General Assembly. And as you can see, the green area was supposed to be for the Jews, and the orange area was supposed to be for the Palestinians. Now, there's many anomalies with this particular recommendation. In that particular period, 1947, 1948, Jews only owned 6% of the land of Palestine. All of the purchases that had been done from 1921 to 1948 did not yield more than 6% of the territory of Palestine. So that's one anomaly. And so they can take more, over 50%, about 51% of the territory. The second anomaly is that in the territory that was supposed to be the Jewish state, that is the green area, 49% of the population were Palestinian, Arab Muslim Christian too. So even in the area of the Jewish state, they don't really count as a majority. But nonetheless, this recommendation was made and forced upon the local population, as well as other member states of the United Nations who didn't really want to vote for this. They were put under pressure to accept this particular recommendation. And you can imagine why the Palestinians will refuse to allow for such a partition. They're seeing the best area of land taken away and given to some European population who had just come, like last year or 2 years ago or 3 years ago or 10 years ago to the area. So indeed, was a major victory for the Zionist movement, and they began to drive people out. This is the first beginning of the first migrations of the Palestinians by force, and this is where you get massacres like Tantura and others in the area of green shaded area where Palestinians were being driven out of that territory, okay, to other areas. Some of them went to Lebanon, some of them went down south into Gaza, some of them came to the West Bank, but not all yet. The majority of the second migration, if you want, of the Palestinians took place after May 15th, 1948. That's about 4 months later. So November 29, you got December, January, February, all of this territory was being evacuated, taken out, where Palestinians being driven out. By May 15th, this is the declaration, quote unquote, of independence, having used the idea from 1939 that the British are occupiers and that the Zionists are doing their against the war against the occupation. May 15th, that's when Israel was declared a state, and this is the mandate was supposed to end also at that particular date. This is when the armies of Transjordan, that is in the east part of east of the Jordan River, the Kingdom of Egypt and Kingdom of Iraq, parts of Syria, made an attempt to come in and forestall the evacuation of the Palestinians by force from the Israeli, now constituted as the Israeli force or Israeli army. And that supposedly is the Great War of 1948, according to Israeli historians. And we know very much that that was just basically bunk, because the leader of the Jordanian army was Gulab Pasha, a British man himself. Syria was under French control. Kingdom of Egypt is very well known incident where the guns that King Farouk had given to the army began to backfire on them and caused great death amongst the Egyptian army itself. So it was a whole together a farce as far as forestalling the Israeli creation. But nonetheless, Israel was created because of the intervention of all of these powers, the United Nations, United States, England, and France. And indeed, this would have been the...
Dr. Mahmood Ibrahim, I apologize. This is a wonderful presentation and we're learning so much. However, it's almost 8 o'clock and we have a few questions. Is it all right if we move into questions?
Oh, sure. I'm sorry for talking so long. You know, it's really, it's just a very dear history to me. Go ahead.
We're learning a lot, mashallah. I'm just...
Before you ask the questions, Erica, I know Dr. Mahmoud has a very detailed presentation, and I'm really learning a lot. And I was wondering if Dr. Mahmoud is open to us recording with you separately the rest of the presentation as a second session so that we can have it on the Islamic Center YouTube channel and making it available for everybody, because we definitely would hate to lose all that knowledge and all that presentation that you prepared. So we can go ahead with the questions and record separately the rest of the presentation. Would you be open to that?
Yeah, sure. I'm open to anything.
Thank you. Go ahead, Erica.
Okay, so the first question that we have is, what is the meaning of the word Jimzu?
Jimzu. Well, Jimzu is the name of a town, you know, historically, perhaps comes from the tree called Jimmaiz. And Jimmaiz is a very hardy tree with trunks and branches that are very solid, and that was used for construction. So perhaps the word Jimzu comes from Jimmaiz, that particular tree.
Okay, wonderful. And the second question is, what is the relation between Lord Rothschild and the Zionist Federation? Why did Balfour address his letter to Rothschild?
Well, Rothschild was the financier, very, very, very wealthy. The Rothschild family continues to be very wealthy in Europe. They were very wealthy, and they were financiers and who financed basically the first and second Aliyah, as I mentioned, in 1882 and 1890s, sponsoring, giving money for the Jews from Europe to go and settle in Palestine. As I mentioned, some of those succeeded, some of them didn't. Some of them went back. But of course, as a financier, he was very influential within the Zionist movement as a whole. Zionism was actually an ideology that thrived amongst the urban elite assimilados or assimilated Jews, and the Rothschilds were part, sort of like the epitome of that particular elite of Europe, of Jewish European Jews. And so very, very well known and perhaps even, you know, they could finance imperial projects within England, and so that's why it was in their name that the letter was given. And perhaps even as a subterfuge, you know, the British were very wily, you know, like Wile E. Coyote. It was very, very indeed using these kinds of tricks to mollify people and make and deflect criticism, but largely because they were very influential European elite Jews.
Okay, wonderful. And the third question is, Balfour in his letter stated that nothing may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Israel is in violation of even the Balfour Declaration. Can you share your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the British themselves were in violation of the Balfour Declaration, right? Because they were the power. They were the power that was in control of Palestine, but they were doing the very policies, whether agricultural policies. Palestinians were hung for being caught with a gun, for example, where at the same time they used to facilitate the purchase of armaments by Zionist militias. As a matter of fact, part of World War II is very well known. Like, this is where Igal Alon, for example, this is where Moshe Dayan got their training. They became part of the British Army. And so, yeah, indeed, they were in violation of the Balfour Declaration themselves. But the Balfour Declaration itself is in violation of the reality of Palestine. This is an impossibility. That's a dilemma that they created, and that dilemma is which will give them the excuse to go one way or another. Yes, indeed, Israel is the same thing today. You know, humanitarian law, international law, all the laws on the books today in the United States, for example, the arms export law is not followed by Israel. But, you know, the United States is not doing anything about it. So it's the imperial prerogative, so to speak, and these are imperial powers. They thought that they were going to be lasting forever. You know, they didn't. You know, they don't know history, and that things change. They don't stay the same. Yeah, but we have the evidence of their hubris, thinking that they are really they're going to be the imperial power forever.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Mahmood Ibrahim and Sister Hadab. Did you want to give some closing remarks, Sister Hadab?
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim, for this unbelievable education and detailed history. I know you still have part of this presentation about the history of Palestine, and I would love for you to record the second part, and perhaps we can arrange that with Erica and the team at the Islamic Center so that we can make the full section and full presentation about the history of Palestine available for everybody to watch. Next week, on the 22nd, same time next week, Dr. Ibrahim will be sharing with us the history of Gaza. Many people, with everything that is happening in the news, they think the history of Gaza is the 16 years of siege by Israel or the 75 years of occupation as part of Palestine. But the history of Gaza goes way beyond that. And I personally asked Dr. Ibrahim if he can teach us about the history of Gaza, especially that Gaza has been colonized throughout history so many times, have been destroyed and rebuilt. And I think learning about the history of Gaza would be definitely not only educational, but I'm hoping a source of inspiration and hope that, God willing, Gaza will be free and Gaza will be rebuilt. I'm really looking forward to next week. I hope everybody will join us. with open mind and open heart to learn. I thank you again, Dr. Ibrahim, and I look forward to continuing this journey of learning and journey of education on the history of Palestine. Thank you, and God
Thank you.
bless.
Thank you very much. And again, I would have loved to go on and on. I know the time is limited, but sure. I mean, and you'll have the PowerPoint, and hopefully that will become useful for us who are here.
Absolutely. I will connect with you offline, and we'll talk about the other resources that you wanted to share with the audience, and we will organize how to record the second part and get those resources available to the audience.
Excellent, excellent. Be happy to.
Thank you. God bless.
Thank you very much.
Very much, everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good night.
Good night.